plan of time. On the principle that no one gets it all right, it is safe to attempt to construct your own prophetic chronology using the insights gained by those who have gone before you. In fact, this is the best way to grow in wisdom and understanding on this matter. Reading someone else's work can be hard going, especially if there are a lot of digressions, footnotes, and references to other works. However, if you do make your own charts and time plans based on the Bible, you do not have to follow someone else's reasoning. It just has to make sense to you. This is one reason that I have included a page on the website on spiritual principles. Probably the most important thing is to study prophecy in a spirit of humility, knowing that we can only know what God reveals to us, and even then we can only know in part. Below is an example of how a prophetic chart can be constructed using the principles outlined on this site. So the first thing is creation started with Adam and Eve. Mark chapter 10 verse 6 tells us, but from the beginning of the creation God made them, male and female. So we know that Adam and Eve were there at the start of creation at year dot, or as I've got it here, year 0. I'm counting in years of 360 days, because this is how prophetic years are counted in the Bible. There is a page on that on the website if you're interested. So we can count forward 1,000 prophetic years from creation, and the next big date is 1,656 years, the year of the flood, when Noah was 600 years old. It's also the year when his grandfather Methuselah died. Count on then 2,000 years from creation, and then we come to 2008 years from creation, the year that Abraham was born. The Bible then tells us that Abraham left Haran when he was 75 years old, so that would bring us 75 years from 2008 brings us to 2083. We then know from Exodus chapter 12 verse 40 that it says, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. So literally, actually, that means they dwelt in Egypt and Canaan for 430 years. The Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint versions tell us that the 430 years included the time spent by Abraham and his family in Canaan before they went on to Egypt. So from 430 years from 2083 brings us to 2513, which was the date of the Exodus, which was the end of the time in Egypt and the start of the time when Moses led the children of Israel into the wilderness and eventually to the promised land. The next date I've got here is 2993, because 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 tells us that the temple was started 480 years after the Exodus, which, as we've seen, was in 2513. It then took 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 38 tells us it took 7 years to complete the temple. So that brings us remarkably to the year 3000, the completion of the temple. So the Solomon's temple was completed exactly 3,000 years after the beginning of creation, and it marks the halfway point of the 6,000 years of history. It was kind of like a high point when Solomon, in all his glory, completed the temple. Things have been on and up from that point, and you could say they started declining after that point. We then have another amazing neatness in scripture. 4,000 Bible years on brings us to the exact date of the crucifixion of Jesus, which this date is determined by many people, including Harold Herner. You can see how he got that date of the 3rd of April 33 AD on the website page on the 70 weeks of Daniel. So amazingly, the prophetic years in the Bible split into very neat chunks. Exactly 3,000 years to the start of Solomon's temple, and then exactly 4,000 years to the crucifixion of Jesus. We then have 5,000 years from the start of creation, and then amazingly, 6,000 years ends precisely on the 31st of December 2000 AD, the very end of the 20th century. And if you're interested, you can also come to that time, because it's exactly 30,000 days after the 11th of November 1918. You can see the page on the 30,000 day year to see more on that. But as I've said elsewhere on the site, many people saw the 11th of the 11th, 1918, as the start of the final hour. And there were many prophetic teachers who spoke that at the time. And 30,000 days on from that date brings us to the end of the 20th century. So I hope you found that interesting. Obviously, it's the kind of thing that you need to study more for yourself to get familiar with the details. It's kind of simpler if you just add up the Bible years. You can slot in the calendar dates, but you've got to remember that the calendar dates do not include time. They include times that aren't recognized by God. So obviously the chart is not the final answer. It's based on a certain amount of opinion and conjecture. It's given as an illustration of how you can start working on a prophetic timeline yourself to deepen your understanding of God's purposes. The calendar dates will not at first make sense because they include some unreckoned years that are not recognized by God, whereas the Bible years do not include the unrecognized years. You can see the web pages on the Jubilee Cycle and Sir Edward Denny for more information on unreckoned years. If you found this interesting, you can find more information at prophecy-workshop.com. Thank you for listening.